This is kind of our fun, happy story because RagnarLocker was taken down by law enforcement. I'm going to let Steven kick this one off after I kind of explain some of the nuances to this one. But we actually had some a good experience with this as part of an engagement. But RagnarLocker, this was a combined effort between multiple organizations with Europol, U.S. Law enforcement companies, and judicial authorities. They were able to get the developer of the RagnarLocker in Paris. They also interviewed five others. I also did see, because if they're going to interview a developer, he probably has connections to other parts of the ransomware gang underworld. A Hive member was recently caught as well too, and was being and I think they were. I don't know if you guys have seen this. It was on a newsletter I read pretty regularly, but and it was on like a French website, so I had to do the Google Translate. But it was the person that handles the money, which to me is kind of big, and that's to me a big, huge win for law enforcement. So, Stephen, I'll let you kind of go on it as far as our experience, though.
Yeah, no, so in this case, it was really interesting. We had the pleasure of helping a client that was actually hit by RagnarLocker ahead of the takedown, and then through the few weeks of work to secure, get them back online, we started to see things like the web presence for RagnarLocker go dark. Their customer communication and support portal died. A few days later, we started to see their command and control nodes start to be taken down and no longer connect. Stop responding to a lot of the tests or other looks that we were doing into those things. And so, over the course of a few weeks, we got to visually see this play out, and then maybe a week after that was when the first news article started to drop about the takedown, and it was very exciting and a wonderful thing to be able to tell the client that was involved, that this criminal group who had previously hurt them, that was positioning these demands and had encrypted a large portion of their environment, was now out of commission. And not that there was no risk, because of course there's rebranding or folks that weren't caught that can go and start things back up at a future time, but that key individuals and systems within the RagnarLocker backyard were definitely seized and taken down by law enforcement. And so that was not something that happens very often, but it was a really, really fun conversation to have with that client. So this news story and activity in particular is really interesting to us for that reason.
It's like they say, follow the money.
Yeah.
Follow the money. Sorry, I think you were about to say something. I didn't want to interrupt there.
No, you're good. I was just going to say, I think this type of action is much more needed, especially with the way that crime is kind of evolving. Ransomware still being a strong trend in the industry, but criminals kind of diversifying how they're approaching exploitation of victims. And it's always good to see wins in the law enforcement front, because there was a time where there really wasn't a lot of that, and law enforcement was very unsuccessful at unseating a lot of these even very large ransomware gangs that were causing a lot of damage and creating a lot of financial distress in the industries they were affecting.
Well, I think to that point too, it becomes because getting online and going to websites and doing stuff, they say never hack stuff, but you actually have to get caught. The more these ransomware gangs get caught, the less lucrative it is for them. And really, a lot of people are trying to do the right thing, but it's paying out so much at this point that a lot of people, it can draw them in, even if they're good people and they have just crappy life situations, right? And they can't get a job and they can't pay the bills, they've got medical expenses, things like that. And so hopefully, to your point, if law enforcement gets more involved and starts making this more risky of an endeavor for people, they're going to try to actually go get a legitimate job instead of ending up behind bars. But the underground is also flush with pictures of cars and money and all this other stuff that it is an enticing draw.
we are seeing more activity though, and able to enforce more frequently. And so, like, we have seen some of those actors when they've gone abroad, we with Interpol have been able to get them. The challenge is that we just had one not long ago where the actor was let go after 18 months, and so that was that, right? And so the question on the law enforcement side is, well, how long should, that's like a policy question that I don't have the answer to, but how long should these people be forced to be incarcerated, and does it help, right? Because I don't know that I don't have numbers on recidivism rates, but I'm guessing for hackers it's decently high, right? You have to have like a little tag on your machine or something. I don't know, but these are things that we are getting better, more sophisticated, and able to reach, because the biggest challenge, to the point of everyone here, is the ability to reach in and actually prosecute and get results of that prosecution. We have all these standing warrants for organizations and people within those organizations. To just track them and find them and arrest them, that's a big challenge, but it's happening more frequently than it ever has.
One thing I put out there when I was talking with Stephen about this topic, a few days ago, I love this story. I thought it was great. I go, but this was only feasible because of the location of where these threat actors were.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So depending on the geo of where they're located, and this is why, and we talked about this too, Stephen, at the start of the Ukraine war, you saw ransomware just plummet, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's definite reasons why that would happen because of where some of these threat actors were located in both the Ukraine and Russia, and they got conscripted. But even outside of that, there's another great book that I'm going to throw out there called The Cuckoo's Egg. And this one's great for every listener that's not cyber focused, but it reads like a James Bond film. But this goes back to the early 1980s. And you look at when they got law enforcement involved, when this astronomer discovered a discrepancy of a few pennies at a university, strictly because at a university, if you're using this giant telescope and people have access to it, it's all based on funding that you get. And that funding, every penny has to be accounted for. And there's a few cents off. And it turned out someone was calling in from Europe. But that person was a professor. Turns out that professor was on sabbatical, so someone was using his account. And when he called the FBI, because he found that, and I won't give away the whole story, but he found that this person that was navigating in here was then moving over to different military installations and searching for weird code words that he didn't know what they were. But when he told the government, they're like, oh, that's a secret missile program. That's this, right? But the FBI said, well, what's the financial impact? He goes, 3.5 cents. And they were like, call someone who cares. Click. Why? Because the impact to him was 3.5 cents. But what were they getting, right? And this goes into a much broader conversation because everyone talks about ransomware. But there's a reason why China becomes such a big focus in conversation, because the different threat actors in all different parts of the geo, some are focused strictly on ransomware or business email compromise to get quick payment. Others are very focused on your data, right, and your intellectual property, because those advancements will pay off 10 years down the road. And it took, in the Cuckoo's Egg, years to explain to certain government agency why this was such a big impact, right? And even then to track it down, and that's the cool part, so I won't give that away. But that's really what I see as like, this was a great example of a takedown. But some of the better stories that I've seen come out, right, where someone was trying to steal, I think it was the Pepsi Cola, trade secret of how to line the aluminum can, right, and why that would be so important. It doesn't sound that big, like it's a coating on an aluminum can, but what is that actually worth, right, competitive-wise in the market, right? And those are the things that people are going after. And I saw that in 16 years of automotive, right? Like when you're working on projects that are 5 years out, right? And we were working on, advanced detection systems, not on the cyber side, but on driverless vehicles, right? And what we were doing at that stage, even 7-10 years ago, right? Why that was so valuable, because it takes 10 years of doing the research to be able to develop a product to bring to market, right? So I throw that out there because, one, the book's great. Two, this was a great story, but it really is focused on money, follow the money. But then there's the second part of that is follow the technology and why that's important.
Well, and it's particularly important because there's the other element of this, which is motivation and intent. And we often hear, especially smaller organizations, say, "Oh, I don't need to do fill in the blank thing. I don't need security. I don't need insurance. I don't need whatever," because I don't have anything that anybody wants. And I try to remind those people, you do not get to be the judge of that. You do not know the motivation and intent of the adversary, and so therefore, those types of scenarios are very difficult to determine, and it's not up to you to determine what's valuable to them. And in fact, you're probably going to be wrong anyway. Even if you had $10 million sitting on your desk, you still could be wrong entirely. So it's a great example. And so it's a really good point, because ultimately we can reverse engineer that to follow the money. And especially in criminal gangs, it's a much easier scenario when we're talking about nation state motivations. All bets are off, because it's very difficult to go backwards. And you're right, it's not about money very often. So that's what makes our world more interesting than many others, I guess.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think those not only are those other motivation, like non-financial motivations, difficult to quantify, but it's not like threat actors are going to leave that in the note when they're hitting you, right? If they have those intentions, those state actors are not going to make it easy for you to understand what they're targeting forensically or otherwise. And it is great that we're making progress on the ransomware front, and with a lot of the criminal groups that are financially motivated. But to your point, Brian and Kirsten, I think countries that don't extradite or that will not comply with law enforcement around the globe to help address those things are only going to embolden and position those geographic locations as jumping off points for threat actors that are in the market to get funding from different state and federal agencies of different military and intelligence organizations around the world. Are they going to be on their payroll? No, but the money is going to flow through them and be connected to them in a way that they're going to be able to influence the priorities, motivations, and targets of their victims, and in so doing, also obfuscate what it is they're after. A great example I could raise is years ago we did a case for a manufacturing company here in the States that was targeted by the Conti ransomware gang based out of St. Petersburg, if folks are familiar with them. And the primary reason for the attack seemed to be the theft of some specific trade secrets and disruption of some of their manufacturing activities. And a lot of that correlated with some geopolitical events that were happening at that time. This was in 2021. And it was really interesting to see how much more involved and aware three-letter agencies were in interpreting and I guess building backwards the story of what happened there and using that to help aid in their search for some of those details. Because in previous years, those were conversations we were never experiencing, or not very often, with law enforcement. Frequently, Brian, it would play out the way that you suggested. You call the FBI or whatever law enforcement agency might be involved or have jurisdiction over what's going on, and their first and central question is always financial impact, when that's not necessarily in some of those cases of intellectual property or other forms of crime that are still very pervasive and happening even today at a greater rate. Those are just didn't seem to be on their radar. So it is good to see that things are shifting in that direction, but I do think it's going to continue to be a complicated and challenging box to unpack for law enforcement.
Yeah, I agree. One thing I was going to add there too, since I brought up the cuckoo's egg, Stephen, the name of the book, if those that are familiar with the cuckoo bird, right? It lays an egg in another bird's nest and allows it to hatch so that other bird takes care of its baby, feeds its baby, etc. And the name of the book came from the fact that every day that he booted the person out, the next day it hatched again. And it just kept happening and happening and happening. And I thought it was a really cool take as an example. One, I had no idea what a cuckoo bird was, but understanding the cuckoo's egg, right? And the idea of planting something that hatches and your system takes care of it every day and feeds it. right, is a really good example. But you're right. The 5 cents to them was what's the problem? What's the biggest problem? And at the time, if you go back to the early 1980s, there wasn't a good understanding of how the internet was being used, right? It was this open tool for these universities to be able to communicate and share knowledge rather quickly. That's definitely evolved, and we've seen that, especially as far as we've gotten today and the rise of AI. So I think there's a good understanding of it now and why some of the rules and regulations have come down. And it will be really interesting to see how some of the prosecution takes place in the future for crimes that don't necessarily have a dollar figure planted on it in terms of this is what it cost us today, but what it could cost us tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think kind of, an understanding of what that data is worth, and what that actual, business system itself might be worth. First off, I mean, would lend to the, businesses maybe taking it a little bit more serious to put some, proactive and preventative measures in place. But also to your point, where does that lead from kind of that prosecution standpoint, or, even how does that fuel what, lack of a better word, what the bad guys might do? Because take somebody breaking into your house, for instance, they might not even know what they're looking for, but once they get in there, right, they might find something and determine, well, this data or this asset could be worth a lot. Let's do the outreach and find out who's the highest bidder, right? So I think it's, really have to have a deeper understanding of that, because the end game might be very different, for the people on the other side, one way or the other.
Yeah, no, and I think an interesting anecdote I can share that's a great example of that is, we're in the past we've worked in multiple industries that have a high volume of personally identifiable information and lots of things that are traditionally considered a target for criminals and are in fact a target for criminals. But what was interesting about the situation that I'm going to describe is that the organization that was targeted, when they were completely compromised with ransomware, the gang in question encrypted every asset they had, all their data, everything. But at the end of the day, their insurance and other kind of measures, risk management measures they had in place for the students and for employees of the organization really adequately addressed some of those risks. And there were, of course, disclosures that had to happen, but that's all kind of to be expected under those circumstances. But what was troubling to them and what actually compelled them to pay a ransom was not any of that. It was this kind of dirty laundry repository of unresolved legal situations or issues with staff or issues with other folks that became the subject of extortion between the criminal and the victim. And so, to your point, Brian, I think we're going to see more of that as criminals get smarter about the real value of those things, and we've already seen this type of exploitation happen in the last 2-3 years here. So I have to believe it's only going to be a trend that continues to rise upward and becomes more common.
Yeah, to that point, there was a ransomware gang. I don't have the details right in front of me, so I'm not going to name it out, but they put in the SEC filing against the company that they ransomware.
Yeah.
So
I was going to mention that.
Yeah, that is to me interesting. But to your point, Stephen, like the ransomware gangs are always looking for new ways to get pretty much the company in trouble, especially if they're not planning to pay.
Yep. Yes, indeed. I think it's a fascinating thing to keep an eye on, and I think it'll only the most interesting stuff is yet to come. I think we're only seeing kind of the beginnings of it in the last couple of years here.